World of Warfare presents The Battle of France. After Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1st of 1939, Europe experienced an 8-month period of relative peace known as the Phony War, or Sitzkrieg to German soldiers, when no Allied land operations took place along the Western Front. While the people of Great Britain clearly enjoyed this period of calm before the storm, Hitler's lull was not due to a change of heart over his empire-building aspirations, but rather due to the fact that his main Blitzkrieg force was busy invading Norway and Denmark, a lull that allowed the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, to be dispatched to the Franco-Belgian border with the goal of pushing the Germans out of Western Europe. Instead, as 1940 progressed, Hitler's stranglehold on Europe increased in tandem with his repeated forays into new territories, at last ending the Phony War period on May the 10th, when the Nazis invaded the neutral Low Countries of Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The Nazis' Blitzkrieg proved to be a vicious onslaught against civilians, as the Luftwaffe in particular rained down terror on European cities. Ironically, on the same day as Hitler's Blitzkrieg began, confidence in British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government had reached a low point, leading to Chamberlain's resignation, followed by the rise of Winston Churchill, an appointment that would inspire the British people throughout the coming dark years of war. To combat the Nazis' invasion of the Low Countries, 150,000 troops with the BEF landed in France to add strength to the sizable yet antiquated French army, commencing an offensive into Germany's lightly defended western frontier. While Adolf Hitler lost sleep over the possibility of facing an all-out war on two fronts, the French army's outmoded tactics, which relied on heavy artillery cover, ended Hitler's worries when the Allies' offensive bogged down by late May, withdrawing completely as German reinforcements from the east fortified German forces in the west. Hitler's two-front worries were further alleviated in late August with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, officially known as the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Soviet Union, ensuring peace along the Eastern Front. Another of Hitler's worries before his May 10th invasion of the Low Countries was the fear that his offensive into Western Europe would bog down into a stalemate war of attrition, as witnessed during the First World War, when men fought sporadically in trenches from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. Throughout the winter months of 1939 to 1940, Hitler and his generals debated back and forth about the best way to mount their offensive, resulting in a two-prong attack strategy into France. The first, known as Deployment Directive Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, would see a German attack along the same route their fathers had taken in 1914 under the Schlieffen Plan, with expectations that the Allies would meet them yet again in the fields of Flanders. Once the Allies had committed their best troops into the north, the Germans would then launch a massive attack at Sedan, France, before pushing through the Ardennes forest, which the French deemed impassable. Germany's plan was to crash into France with an armored spearhead before crossing the Meuse River for a two-pronged pincer maneuver all the way to the English Channel, roughly following the Somme River, where Fall Rat, or Case Red, would finish off Allied troops following an anticipated Allied evacuation at the port of Dunkirk. The plan was audacious and risky at best, since the mountainous, heavily forested terrain of the Ardennes made the region an unlikely candidate for blitzkrieg tactics, which relied on spreading out to bypass strong points until they could surround each enemy obstacle before destroying it. Despite pushback from his generals that the narrow roads through the Ardennes could turn into a kill zone by Allied aerial bombardment and artillery, Hitler decided to go for it. By the spring of 1940, the Allies knew that an invasion through the Low Countries was a matter of when rather than if, prompting them to activate the Dealey Plan, otherwise known as Plan D, which was a scheme created by the commander-in-chief of the French army General Maurice Gamelin, to defeat a German attempt to invade France through Belgium, intended to halt any German advance by placing troops along the Dyle River in Belgium. 53 miles long from its headwaters to its confluence with the Needy River in Rumst, the Dyle Plan relied on total cooperation between British, French, Belgian, and Dutch troops to defend the most likely route of German invasions. However, due to the staunch neutrality of Belgium and Holland, French and British troops had to sit on their hands along the French border until Belgium asked for support after Hitler's invasion force was already in the country. Just before dawn on May the 10th, hundreds of German bombers went airborne from bases throughout western Germany, targeting troops amassed along the French border, along with railheads and communication infrastructure in the Netherlands, France, and Belgium. German paratroopers descended to secure important points, while swarms of Luftwaffe fighters went after Allied spotter planes attempting to gauge German troop strength and armor columns heading through Luxembourg into the Ardennes. Working in unison with the Germans' 19th Armored Corps of some 745 armored fighting vehicles, Stuka dive bombers acted as airborne artillery against Allied positions, flying just in front of the lead tanks to deliver 550-pound high-explosive bombs onto Allied strongpoints. Behind the Blitzkrieg armored columns at the spearhead, 41,000 other vehicles brought up men and supplies for the advancing German army, who descended on the Ardennes against underprepared and under-equipped Allied forces, thanks to the belief by French war leaders that an attack through the Ardennes was highly improbable due to its geographic challenges. Of the 250 Allied tanks spread out over a 60-mile front, most would prove to be ineffective against the Germans' highly condensed armored columns. In fact, the only thing that slowed the Nazis' advance was the sheer volume of traffic on the region's narrow roads, which by May the 11th saw a queue of German vehicles stretching 120 miles long, including some units which had not even left Germany yet. To make matters worse for the Allies, when several Allied spotter planes managed to report the massive German troop buildup in the Ardennes, Allied war leaders dismissed it as a feint. On the morning of May the 12th, 48 hours after Hitler's invasion began, Allied resistance in the village of Bouillon along the French-Belgian border collapsed under the Germans' advance from the rear. German reports indicated that the Allied troops at Bouillon was made up of fat and flabby 30-somethings with poor discipline and a lack of courage, many of whom fled the Germans without firing a shot. Meanwhile, to the north, the Dutch army fought a desperate rearguard action as the Germans swept across the countryside, while in Belgium, one of the nation's most modern fortresses in Europe, Fort Eben-Emael, fell to the Nazis. Initially, Allied war leaders believed that the Belgian army would need to hold off a German advance for several weeks so that troops could be rushed to the Dyle River. However, by the close of the second day, the Allies' Dyle Plan defenses were already in place, while lead German elements had taken up positions along the Meuse River. In the north on May 12th and 13th, the battles of Hanut and Gembloux devolved into the largest tank battle yet fought, engaging some 1,500 armored vehicles, and while the French managed to knock out 160 German tanks, the Germans were left in control of the battlefield after the French executed a planned withdrawal. In the south, meanwhile, Allied war leaders wrongly estimated that the Germans would take several days to reinforce their lead units along the Dyle. However, at 10 a.m. on the morning of May 14th, the full might of the German Blitzkrieg was unleashed against French defenders at Sedan, supporting the Meuse line. Consisting of a strong defensive belt 3.5 miles deep, the Meuse line was strengthened by 103 pillboxes manned by the 147th Fortress Infantry Regiment, while deeper positions were defended by the French 55th Infantry Division, who were reinforced on May 13th to include the 71st Infantry Division. Again on May 13th, the Germans' Panzergruppe Kleist forced 3 river crossings near Sedan. followed by German infantry divisions, while the Luftwaffe dive-bombed and carpet-bombed French positions with the heaviest air bombardment yet witnessed in military history, and the most intense by the Germans during the entirety of the war, launching 3,940 sorties flown by 9 bomber groups. Morale within the 55th Infantry Division fractured under the weight of pounding air attacks, witnessing many French gunners fleeing the field as the Germans advanced 5 miles into the French defensive zone by midnight. With Allied communications shattered and French resistance only holding out in scattered pockets, the defensive Meuse line was broken at a surprisingly low casualty count for the French of just 56. On May 14th, the Luftwaffe launched a devastating bombing raid on Rotterdam in the Netherlands, an event that razed the entire city to the ground in an attack lasting no more than 15 minutes. The raid took the lives of 850 people while destroying 24,000 homes and leaving 80,000 homeless. The next day, fearing further destruction and loss of life to the nation's civilian population, the Dutch government capitulated, in turn collapsing the northern flank of the Allies' defense. As Allied defenders began to retreat, the Germans began to break out on May 15th, despite Hitler's concerns that his troops were advancing too far and too fast in front of his supply lines. That same day, French Premier Paul Reynaud phoned newly minted British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, confessing that "we are defeated, we are beaten, we have lost the battle." Churchill tried desperately to rally his counterpart, reminding him of the 1914 defense of Paris when all seemed lost, flying to Paris for emergency meetings with Reynaud and General Maurice Gamelin. When Churchill witnessed French businessmen and government officials burning important documents in advance of their departure from Paris, Churchill asked Gamelin, "Where is your strategic reserve?" At which point Gamelin replied, "Aucune, there is none." Churchill would later describe the meeting as one of the most shocking moments of his life. Unable to reinforce a counterattack at Sedan due to, in Gamelin's words, inferiority of numbers, inferiority of equipment, inferiority of methods, only Charles de Gaulle's 4th Armored Division slowed the German advance in the north by using his tanks as a concentrated unit, until the Germans broke through 2 fairly weak BEF divisions on the 19th, sweeping into the Somme on the following day. Reaching the coast of the English Channel, the Allies were now in disarray as they desperately tried to break out of the Germans' ever-tightening pocket. With communications now broken between Allied forces, the French launched an attack at Canberra, while the British launched their own counterattack at Arras. And while both offensives achieved initial success, ultimately they were unable to break the German lines. On May 23rd, accordingly, Lord Gort, the head of the BEF in France, ordered a retreat from Arras for a possible evacuation at Dunkirk. The push to evacuate hundreds of thousands of trapped Allied soldiers got a boost from Hitler himself, who on May 24th ordered a halt to the advance of German panzer divisions pressing in on Dunkirk. The divisions were told to hold the line of the canal and make use of the period of rest for general recuperation. And given the fact that the Germans arrogantly believed that the Allies were doomed at Dunkirk, German troops largely believed that the situation left Hitler and the German High Command with a sense of little urgency to finish the task at speed. While historians still hotly debate Hitler's ultimate decision or blunder, most agree that his decision was based on his generals' concern over an Allied counterattack, much like the failed counterattack south of Arras on May 21st, as well as Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring's insistence that his superior air forces could easily halt any evacuation attempts at Dunkirk. Codenamed Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk was green-lighted on May 26 after Winston Churchill and most of his cabinet decided that further delays would risk even more BEF lives. 2 days later, the decision was validated when Belgian King Leopold ordered a ceasefire before surrendering to the Germans, dealing a bitter blow to the Allies' cause when missing Belgian soldiers left glaring holes in their defensive lines along the French and Belgian coastline. For the trapped Allied soldiers, they continued to make their way toward Dunkirk, the majority without sleep, food, or water for days on end. For those that made it to Dunkirk, they dug what little fortifications they could in the exposed dunes of the beach, making for easy targets by Stuka dive bombers and German artillery. The evacuation of Dunkirk was completed in a matter of days, but for Allied troops on the beaches around Dunkirk, the entire ordeal felt more like an eternity. With death all around them and little information coming in, the phrase "the spirit of Dunkirk" was born on the overcrowded beachhead, when trapped soldiers soon learned that if they could control their fear when the Germans attacked, it was possible to fight back. Survivors have frequently recalled that the noise was the worst part of each attack, but a steady, cool, accurate eye and a rifle could bring down a diving bomber quite effectively. Once the pockets on the Channel coast had been neutralized, the Germans now turned their attention to the rest of the French army under their Fallrot plan or Case Red, and while the French use of their armor slowly improved, the Germans' all-arms attack, in conjunction with the Luftwaffe, overwhelmed France's ability to repel the German advance. Declared an open city on June the 10th, Paris fell to the Germans 4 days later, at the same time overwhelming forces along the Maginot Line. On June 16th, Renault resigned as prime minister, while his successor, Marshal Philippe Pétain, immediately announced his intention to sign an armistice with Germany. The fall of France was completed on June 25th, when the French signed the armistice in the same railway car that the Germans had surrendered in following their defeat in the First World War, making the Battle of France yet another early defeat for the Allied cause.
However matters may go in France, or with the French government, or other French governments, we in this island and in the British Empire will never lose our sense of comradeship with the French people. If we are now called upon to endure what they have been suffering, we shall emulate their courage. And if final victory rewards our toils, they shall share the gains. Aye, and freedom shall be restored to all. We abate nothing of our just demands. Not one jot or tittle do we recede. Czechs, Poles, Norwegians, Dutch, Belgians have joined their causes to our own. All these shall be restored. What General Weygand calls the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us, therefore, brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.